All right, very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar event organized by the Adam Smith Center in Singapore. We are Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-business, pro-market classical liberal values. So first of all, I just want to thank different participating organizations. So first of all, the SMU Economics Intelligence Club Executive Committee, Ryan, Daniel, and Bhavya, thanks very much for participating. So the NTU Economics Society as well, thank you very much for collaborating with us. My friend Max Marlowe from LSE Hayek Society, as well as Johannes, KCL Libertarian Society. And I just want to thank Ms. Sandra Tan as well from the Dean's Office in SMU for your liaison on this. So for today's webinar, our speaker, who is Professor Chandran Kukathas, he will be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which I'll be moderating a question and answer session. So we will end at about 6:30 p.m. sharp. So please drop your questions along the way. You can drop them anytime along the way in the Q&A function at the very bottom. And besides the Q&A function, there is also a function on polls. There is a poll which I've just started. So it's a question I'm just throwing out to everyone here. Should the government ever restrict immigration? And if so, for what reason? Right? So we'll just let people vote on this question, right? And we'll just have some discussion on this. So today's webinar is on the topic of immigration, which is an issue that attracts a diversity of opinions, right? There are some people who are more averse to the inflow of foreigners into a nation, but some people are more open to the inflow of foreigners into a country. Just an interesting point of information, just last month in Singapore, the IPS released a survey which shows that most Singaporeans, especially older Singaporeans, are quite averse to the inflow of foreigners into Singapore. So what do we make about this? So today our speaker is actually Professor Chandran Kukathas. Let me just introduce him for a few moments. He's the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University. He was previously from the London School of Economics, and he's actually a world-renowned political theorist, having written numerous journal articles and books. One of my favorites is actually the book called The Liberal Archipelago, which I highly recommend. He's also an advisory board member at the Adam Smith Center, which is my organization. So without further ado, Professor, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you and the various societies for inviting me and making this occasion possible. So I've been given the title, People Without Borders, for my talk, with the subtitle, Immigration and Freedom. The book that I've just published, here's a copy of it from Princeton University Press, available on Amazon and all good booksellers. The title of my book, Immigration and Freedom, is really the title of this talk. But I like the expression People Without Borders because it brings to light really the underlying theme of my talk and more generally of my thinking about immigration, which is that immigration really is about people. And I think it's something that policy too frequently forgets. Consider this particular quotation from the Swiss dramatist Max Frisch. He wrote in the foreword to a book that he was introducing as follows: "We asked for workers and got people instead." What he has in mind here in this expression is really quite simple. Governments, to some extent, corporations and other organizations really do want workers. And in their search for workers across the labor market, both domestically and abroad, they sometimes forget that workers are actually people. And that means that they aren't just factors of production, but they come with all the things that people have. They've got their own health conditions, they've got friends, they've got relatives, they've got parents, some of whom may be getting elderly, they have attachments, they've got commitments. So when you look for workers, you have to expect to get people, but it's something that all kinds of organizations, and notably governments, forget. And we'll come back to this in my presentation. But let me say a little bit then about how I want to proceed with the talk that I'm going to give you now. And I'll begin by saying something about the basic thesis of this talk. My book is called Immigration and Freedom, as is this subject here today, because what I want to get at is a concern that many people have when it comes to immigration, both in the developed West, but to some extent also in other countries. People are anxious about freedom, particularly in liberal democracies, because they think that immigration poses a danger or a threat to the host society. In particular, they feel that it's a danger to the values of that society. And what I want to suggest in my presentation to you today is that there is a danger, but there's a greater danger in immigration control that people have not really appreciated. Because if you want to control immigration, you will have to do something, do many things that will have a great bearing on the fundamental values of your society. And this is because ultimately, if you want to control immigration, what you'll have to do is firstly control those who are looking to move into your society. But secondly, and more importantly, you're going to have to control your own people. Because if you understand immigration correctly, well, it's really not simply about controlling people crossing the border, because most people who cross the border aren't actually immigrants. They're probably just visitors. They're tourists. They're pilots who are stopping over before they fly off again. There are all kinds of people who cross the border who are not immigrants. But what immigration control is about is controlling not people crossing the border, at least not primarily. It's about controlling what people do once they have crossed the border. And to do that, you have to stop them from doing things you don't want, like taking a job, renting a house, opening a bank account, starting a business, teaching, maybe even forming friendships with other people. And to do this, you've got to control your own population, because your own population is all too likely to try to hire these people or to do business with them, or to enroll them in a university, or to rent to them, or to help them open a bank account, or do all kinds of things which are simply a part of the normal business of engaging with other people. Usually when we are looking for something, whether it's something practical, like a business engagement, or something more personal, we don't ask first where someone is from. We ask who they are, what are they like, what can they do? So in order to control immigrants, you have to control your own citizens. And the argument I want to put to you is that controlling your own citizens means a loss of freedom for your own citizens, and it will probably mean also a loss with respect to your other institutions. And the more seriously you try to control outsiders, the more you will have to control insiders. So that's the basic thesis of today's presentation. And I'm going to present this more fully in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to go over the definitional problems that underpin a lot of this analysis. I'm going to say something about why freedom is endangered, and then something about why other institutional values like the rule of law are also endangered. In the second part, I'll consider some objections to my thesis, in particular, the arguments that say, well, this may all be true, but so what? At least there are gains we're making, economic gains, for example, or gains in the protection of our cultural values, or perhaps simply the gain that we enjoy by being in control of our own destiny. And what I want to say is that none of these gains are actually as substantial as people think, if they're indeed gains at all. But let me begin with the definitional problem. So if you want to control immigration, the first thing to ask is, what is an immigrant? Now, this may seem like a straightforward enough matter, but in fact, a little investigation tells you that it's actually a bit more complicated and indeed, in some ways, altogether confusing. According to the United Nations, an immigrant is someone who's outside his or her country of residence, or rather of nationality, for 12 months or longer. Now, this immediately raises an obvious question. Well, why 12 months? Why not say 6 months? Now, if you said 6 months, then you've suddenly got a lot more immigrants than you thought, because people who are with you for more than 6 months will be immigrants. But what if you made it 2 years? Well, if someone came for 2 years in order to be an immigrant, well, that means that you've got many fewer immigrants than you have right now. Now, this may seem like a bit of quibbling, but it actually has a substantial bearing on a lot of debates and discussions. In the UK, for example, over the last decade, various governments have promised to cut down migration. At one stage, the Conservative government under Mr. Cameron said they were going to reduce immigration numbers from 300,000 to 100,000. But it all depends on what you count as an immigrant. For example, do you count students as immigrants? Well, in one way they don't, because if they come for less than a year, they clearly can't count as immigrants. But if they stay a bit longer to do a 4-year degree or a 3-year degree, do they count as immigrants? Well, the government and the opposition have gone back and forth on this question because they don't agree. If you add students, then the immigrant numbers go up. If you take away students, they go down. How are we to count these? So there is no natural definition of an immigrant. An immigrant is, in fact, just someone who is so declared to be by government policy. And even then, for example, if we took the United Kingdom, there is no official definition of an immigrant. In fact, and in UK law, there is only the category of persons with indefinite leave to remain in the United Kingdom. It's simply a matter of whether you have a right to remain, but it doesn't say anything about what exactly is an immigrant. But this brings me to a slightly different problem, which is what exactly is the opposite of an immigrant? So one obvious answer to give is that it's a native, or if you like, a national of a country. But what exactly is a national? Because it seems like it's simply the obverse of an immigrant. But here again, we get into a number of difficulties. It all depends on definition. We simply decide what is a national, what is a native. When I say we, I don't even mean the population as a whole. I mean, governments determine this in one way or another. But at the same time, they don't have a consistent definition of a native or a national. Definitions of this have changed over the years. And in fact, this brings me really to the crucial point. When it comes to immigration and immigration control, although the argument is usually made that it's necessary in order to protect or defend the interests of natives or nationals, what in fact happens from the very beginning is that a determination is made about who is a native and who is a national. And that means the beginning of immigration control is not, in fact, border control. The beginning of immigration control is definition or classification. Now, once again, this may seem like a rather technical set of claims, but let me give it some historical reality. Let's take the United Kingdom to start with. Now, it did not have a category of citizen, for example, until 1948. In 1946, a guy called Freddie Mercury was born. His name was not Freddie Mercury at the time, he was Farouk Bulsara. He was born in Zanzibar to Parsi parents. who moved to the United Kingdom. Now, they moved without needing a visa or without needing any official permission because they were British subjects. In fact, they were British nationals because they were citizens, not even citizens, they were just subjects of the Queen in the British Empire. And in fact, most elderly Singaporeans here, in fact, really anyone who was born before 1955, was at that point a subject of the British Empire, and at that time had the right of abode in the United Kingdom. And this was true for the peoples of many different parts of the world. In fact, you could say, and a person no less significant than the British MP Enoch Powell in the 1960s recognized that at that time there were 800 million people in the world who had the right of residence in the United Kingdom because they were British subjects. If you like, they were British nationals. So what happened? Well, what happened was that over a number of years between 1948 and 1983, the claims of various people across the Commonwealth were gradually changed by British law to exclude them from membership of Great Britain. They were turned, in effect, into potential immigrants, whereas before that, they were not potential immigrants because they had the right of abode. So immigration control really begins with this process of classification. Now, I won't belabor this point, but I can tell you that the same holds in the United States, for example, where if you go back a century, for example, whether or not you're a citizen depended not just on your country of birth, but also on your marital status. If an American woman married a foreigner, she lost her American nationality. She ceased to be American. The laws have also changed over time with respect to who had the right to pass on their nationality. So, for example, even in 1982, a British woman who got who had children to a foreign man could not pass on her nationality. Her children would not be British, although a British man, if he married a foreign woman, could pass on his nationality. What has changed? What has changed is simply the law. The law defines who is a native and who is a potential immigrant. So this is where immigration control begins. But the next point I want to make is that we need to reinforce this point that it's not only not a matter of controlling classification, it's also a matter of controlling something other than borders. It's a matter of controlling what people do once they enter a country, and that means controlling citizens, controlling employers to make sure they don't employ the wrong persons, controlling landlords to make sure they don't rent to the wrong persons, controlling banks so that they don't let the wrong people open up accounts, which is not to say that everyone is prevented from engaging with immigrants, from renting to immigrants, or from doing business with them. What it means is that states then are selective about who among its citizens are allowed to trade, to do business, to engage with, to marry, to befriend outsiders. This is why I want to emphasize that immigration control is significant for us because it's really a control not on outsiders, but on insiders. And moreover, it's a control that on the one hand puts everybody under surveillance and monitoring, but on the other hand, it also selectively privileges some citizens over others. It allows some citizens to do what's of advantage to them, and it denies other citizens the opportunity to take advantage of precisely those chances that are available to others. So if we want to understand immigration and immigration control, we should understand it firstly as something that begins with classification, and secondly, that it's something that involves control and control over citizens, control over the residents of a society, not simply over outsiders. Now, in all of this, you might be thinking, well, so what I'm going to advocate now as an alternative is something that people think of as open borders. And let me say to you at this point, that's not what I'm going to argue for. I'm sympathetic to that idea, but I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way to think about this, because that presumes that we simply understand what an open border could be. But I don't think that's actually particularly clear, particularly given my own thesis about the nature of immigration control. So let me say something then about what I understand by a border and what I understand by the openness or closedness of a border. And the point I want to make here is that borders are not simply open or closed. They are open or closed to a degree. Very, very few places are completely closed. North Korea is probably the closest we can come to in thinking about such a society. But no country is completely open in the sense that there are simply no checks or controls on people's movement across borders. But the openness or closeness of a border depends not simply on whether or not you can enter a country, because if you think of immigration control as primarily about controlling what people do when they enter a country, then you can make a border more or less open, not only by making it possible for people to physically enter a territory, but you can also make the country more open, the borders more open, by allowing them to participate in the life of that country, by taking a job, for example, or renting a property, or setting up a business, or doing any of a range of things. The extent to which you're free to do that is a measure of how open your border is. If your border is open to someone who wants to enter as a worker, but the rules also forbid that worker to bring his or her spouse, then that border is less closed because it's less possible for you to enter. If you can enter, but you can only take a job above a certain pay or below a certain pay, again, your opportunities are limited and the border is less open to you. A border is also less open to you if you can enter and you can participate, but you can't ever become a member. You can't become a citizen. There's no path for you to that. That again makes it less interesting, less enticing, less valuable, an attempt that you want to make in actually crossing that particular boundary. So here are these three things that are ways in which you might consider the openness or closeness of the border. Does it allow you to enter? Does it allow you to take part in the life of the society? Does it allow you to become a member of that society? And there are so many different possibilities. If you consider this table, imagine society one. Yes, you can enter. Yes, you can get a job. Yes, you can become a citizen. That looks very open. If you look at society four, no, you can't enter. No, you can't participate. No, you can't become a member. Well, that's very, very closed. Think of society two. You can enter, you can participate, but you can't ever become a member, or it's very difficult. That's less open. Society three is even less open. You can enter as a tourist, but you can't do anything else. But there are also more complex possibilities. For example, country five, you can't enter, you can't participate, but you might sneak in nonetheless and live your life there and eventually be given amnesty. In which case, yes, that's a bit more open than other societies. Or consider society six, you're not allowed to enter, but you do in fact enter, and they don't monitor things too well, so you do in fact end up maybe buying a house, maybe getting work, and eventually becoming a citizen. Or imagine, number 7, a society which allows you to enter but forbids you to participate by getting a job, for example, but you do so anyway. No one detects you, and eventually you become a citizen. Well, that country is a bit more open than some others, a bit more closed than others. Here's another way of thinking about it. Country A may make it very easy to enter, hard to participate, very hard to become a member. But country B may make it very hard to enter, or hard to enter, very hard to get a job, but very easy once you've succeeded to become a citizen. Or others may make it very hard to get permission to enter. If you can enter, they allow you to work, but they still don't want you to become citizens. It's all a matter of degree. And my point here is that it doesn't make sense simply to ask, do we want open borders or closed borders? Because my question is, well, in what respect and how easy or how hard do you want this to be? But immigration control, ultimately, I want to say, is about controlling citizens. What it is about is controlling not just what immigrants or would-be immigrants do, and to a significant extent, most would-be immigrants who are denied the freedom to enter actually experience very little loss of freedom, because once they're denied that opportunity to move, that's the end of the story. But for citizens, the control is permanent, because once society has decided that it's going to limit immigration by controlling what would-be immigrants do once they've entered a society, it will have to set up mechanisms for constantly controlling, regulating, and monitoring their own citizens to make sure that they don't wittingly or unwittingly undermine the goals of policy. And once again, I think it's worth noting that citizens are all too ready to, in fact, associate with outsiders, because usually it's to their advantage. People in business want workers. They want people in the labor market. And very often it's difficult to find the people they want or they need among their own citizens. People within a country want their friends to enter. They want relatives to come. They want to have friendships and associations with people from other parts of the world. All of that will have to be controlled. And I think it's worth noting the extent to which these controls are in fact imposed upon citizens to an extent that is actually quite harmful. Let me give you first a very dramatic example of this, and then some less dramatic ones. The most dramatic one I can think of is the case of the United States, which between 1930 and 2000 deported 1 million of its own citizens, many of these native-born American citizens. Now, how could such a thing come about? Well, it came about because at various stages, America wanted workers, so they admitted people, mostly from Mexico, mostly by negotiation with the Mexican government to give them that freedom of movement across to fulfill needs in the labor market that they could not meet otherwise. But at various stages in America's history, it also then became anxious about too much Mexican immigration. And so they initiated sweeps of areas where Mexicans were thought to live and simply rounded them up and sent them back. Now, given that Mexicans have been a part of the United States since at least the early 1800s, when America acquired a good third of its existing territory by buying a part of Mexico and then conquering a part of Mexico. When it did so, it simply absorbed a large number of Mexicans. So many Mexicans have become Americans, but also many people who are of Mexican descent have lived in the United States all their lives and were born to parents who lived there all their lives. Well, when America decided that it was going to deport Mexicans, it therefore inadvertently deported 1 million people who looked like Mexicans. It also, I have to note, continues to do this, as does Britain, as does Australia, to deport its own citizens by mistake, mistaking people who are natives or citizens for outsiders. Every year, about 4,000 Americans are mistakenly deported. At any one time in the United States, at least 1% of the population in detention is American citizens. And the same is true in the European Union, which has hundreds of detention centers. And at any one time, at least 1% of that population is European Union citizens, not immigrants from outside. So immigration control, the more vigorously you pursue it, the more likely it is to endanger your own citizens. But let me give you a slightly less dramatic, but still, concerning example of this. In the United Kingdom, if you want to sponsor someone to move to the United Kingdom, you need an income of at least £18,000 to qualify as a sponsor. The consequence of this is that every year, about 18,000 UK citizens are denied the right to bring their spouse to the United Kingdom. People who are not able to bring not their relatives, but their husbands or wives to the United Kingdom because they don't make enough money to have the right to sponsor them. Over 10 years, that's nearly 200,000 people. And these people who are affected are, of course, not simply the immigrants, but the people who would be sponsors of their own partners. So the more vigorously you pursue immigration control, the more you risk undermining the freedoms and the rights of your own citizens. And again, I'm not talking here about ancient history, I'm talking about current circumstances. In a way, the real problem is that on the one hand, governments simply cannot do without outsiders because for all kinds of reasons, outsiders need to be brought in to the local society and of course, the local economy. But the problem is when people come in, they bring with them all kinds of problems from the government's point of view. On the one hand, they form attachments, which means if they leave or are forced to leave, they leave behind unhappy people. On the other hand, if you don't allow them in, you still have unhappy people for a variety of reasons, whether it's employers or simply human beings. Governments want workers, but they're worried about bringing in people. And if you want an analogy for this dilemma that they face, I can't think of a better one than the dilemma that was faced by the South African government in the years of apartheid, because that government decided, with much popular support, at least among the white population, that what it wanted to do was to preserve the integrity of white society and to keep the Black population apart, ultimately by pushing them off onto what they called homelands, the Bantustans. But the problem was they also needed the labor, and they weren't happy when Black Africans decided to try to go it on their own, setting up their own farms and businesses. So they made it more difficult for them by higher taxes until they drove them back into the white areas looking for work. And at that point, what governments tried to do was prevent them from associating with the local population, but at the same time, making sure that their labor was available. And this is essentially a strategy that I think the Western democracies in particular have deployed. They've wanted the labor, but they've not wanted the people. And so they've tried to negotiate this balance. In South Africa, they negotiated it by the policy of apartheid, which in itself also meant ultimately controlling not just the black population, but the white population, because there was always a danger that the white population would break the rules and fraternize with the black population. And this meant that for government, it was necessary both to monitor, surveil the white population and punish them if they moved away from the accepted rules. But furthermore, they also had to make sure they defended the ideology of apartheid. Western governments, while they repudiate apartheid and racism, have nonetheless been caught in the same dilemma. How do you bring in people, or rather, how do you bring in workers, but not bring in people? And as you can guess, is something that I think simply cannot be achieved. There's another price that they pay as a result of this. The problem is that if then you try to deal with the dilemmas that arise out of the tendency of people to move and the tendency of your citizens to engage with outsiders, the problem is that you won't meet your immigration targets. And so you will be tempted, as governments always are, to try to get around the law. And let me give you an example through the very strange and somewhat amusing story of Mr. Egon Kisch, who was a Prague-born national in Europe before Czechoslovakia existed, who became a strong anti-Nazi journalist, and he was therefore suspected wrongly of being a communist. But he nonetheless continued his anti-Nazi activity, and so was invited by the Australian peace movement in Melbourne in the 1930s to come and give a talk. Well, the Australian government heard about him and put out a note saying that he was not to be allowed onto the country. So when he arrived in Perth, he was stuck on the ship. Of course, the peace movement got very agitated about this, started a campaign to allow him to come. And by the time the ship moved to Melbourne, there was a huge groundswell of popular interest in Mr. Kisch, who was so excited by this that he jumped off the boat and broke his leg. This began a series of processes where he and the peace movement appealed to the courts to allow him to stay, which the courts did, saying that it was illegal to forbid him to stay, at which point the government deployed the infamous dictation test. Australia had a special test for anyone it wanted to exclude. You were asked to take a dictation test in a language, often a language that was not your own, and if you failed, you were not allowed to enter the country. Well, Mr. Kisch was fluent in several languages, and he kept passing these tests until they gave him a test in the language of Scottish Gaelic, which he failed because that was one language he didn't know. But then subsequently, the courts ruled that Scottish Gaelic was not a European language, so the case fell apart, and Mr. Kisch was allowed to stay. The government by this stage was completely humiliated and agreed to drop all charges, provided that he left, which he agreed to do, but not until there was a midnight parade in his honor through the streets of Melbourne. Now, what this case illustrates is the extent to which a government will go to get around the law, to get around due process in order to get its way, because what will stand in its way is, in fact, the rule of law, the regulations, the norms, and indeed the attitudes of the population of its country. The danger of immigration control is that the more seriously it's pursued, the more likely it is that governments will be tempted to get around the law in order to meet targets they cannot otherwise meet. And if you think about this, for example, by considering the United States right now, it has supposedly about 12 million so-called illegal immigrants. Well, in order to deport all of these people, right now, the US has the capacity to do so legally at the rate of about 400,000 people a year. So if you do the math, that'll take about 25 years to deport them all, provided nobody comes back in. So it's going to take you a very, very long time. You've either got to increase the amount of money you spend, that means more money on courts, lawyers, police, detention centers, and so on, or you try to get around this by less legal means. So the real danger to the rule of law with immigration control is that it tempts governments to become desperate to go around the law. The more it sets immigration targets, the more it finds itself out of touch with the community, various parts of which are interested in associating with immigrants, the more it tends to side with one part of the society against the other, and the more it ends up bending the law in order to get its way. So immigration control is something that is a matter of concern to us. I would go so far as to say much more of a concern or a worry than immigration itself. But now, what are the counter arguments? Couldn't someone say, well, that's all true, but maybe it's worth it all the same because there are economic benefits to controlling immigration, and it helps us protect our culture. And ultimately, it means that we will end up in control of our own country. Let me address each of these concerns individually, beginning with the economics of immigration. And I'll go through this quite quickly because time is limited, but we can come to this in the Q&A if you wish. Firstly, on the economics of immigration, there are two aspects to the claim that immigration is economically harmful. One is that it's bad for a society's wealth and income. And the other is that immigration tends to benefit some at the expense of others. So the distribution of the gains from immigration are not equal or proportionate. So let me deal first with the question of the impact of immigration on wealth and income in a country. Now here I think one thing is fairly clear. Most economists think that immigration has a positive effect on the economic well-being of a country. The difficulty is that measuring this impact is a tricky thing. Economists everywhere simply don't agree on how you assess the impact of immigration on national income or on national wealth. The most well-known critic of immigration, who's an immigration economist here, is a man called George Borjas, who wrote a book called Immigration Economics, which is a very technical work, and a more popular one called We Wanted Workers. Now, even he, who is quite critical of immigration and critical of the defenders of immigration, concedes that immigration, in fact, has very little, if any, negative impact on the wealth or income of a country. At most, he says, what's happened is that the advocates of more freedom of immigration have overstated the benefits of immigration, which may be benefits that come in quite a long way into the future, but are not immediate. Very, very few economists disagree with this. Some simply go further to say, no, the gains from immigration in economic terms are even greater than Borjas has acknowledged. But the bigger issue is the distributional question. Here, the argument is, well, of course, immigration is beneficial, but some people benefit more than others. In fact, the rich benefit more than the poor. Now, is this the case? Well, there is something to this argument, although the margins here are actually quite small. It is true that in countries of the developed West, some people benefit more than others. In one sense, of course, any immigrant coming into a country who takes a job that might have been held by by a native is disadvantaging that particular native. But here, what one has to bear in mind is that this is not enough for us to understand the impact of immigration, because the immigrant in question is substituting for the native who's not getting that job. But of course, many immigrants are not simply there because they are substitutes for other potential workers. They're there actually because they complement other workers. That is to say, they have skills, they have assets that make it possible to employ other workers, because without the skills of that immigrant, certain things couldn't be done that would generate further employment. So not all immigration substitutes for the labor of domestic workers. Most immigrants are in fact people who affect natives in both of these ways, taking their jobs, but also making possible more jobs. Overall, the net impact is an increase in the availability of employment. Those who are most likely to be disadvantaged are those who are high school dropouts, who suffer a slight drop in level of pay to about 5% less than they would otherwise make, and also the previous generation of immigrants. They do a little bit worse, although their claims are a little bit compromised since they presumably reduce the income of the previous generation of immigrants. Excuse me.
So, Professor, we have 10 minutes before we go to the Q&A.
I've just got another couple of slides, if that's okay, Brian. So one other thing that, however, is worth noticing here is that the extent to which the poorest members of a society are disadvantaged, from the perspective of the nationalist who thinks that what we should do above all is protect the worst of the poorest nationals from the impact of immigration. Here, I might just ask the following question. If we accept, as most economists do, that the impact of immigration in the long run is an improvement in the wealth and income of the nation, then the next generation of poor will be better off as a result of immigration. If you want to emphasize the importance of protecting nationals, why, I ask, is it important to protect current nationals rather than future nationals? Why are future nationals sacrificed in the interest of the present? Now, let me turn then to the arguments from culture. There are those who want to say that we need to limit immigration in order to protect the integrity of a culture. I'll go a little bit more quickly over this, but I want to raise a particular dilemma that, or two dilemmas that face the defender of immigration control on the basis of culture. The first is, how do you define the culture? Whose culture are you talking about? If you want to say that we as a society have a very, very particular, thick, substantial conception of culture, that means that you're all going to have to agree on what that culture is. But if there is diversity within your society, then those who don't fall under your definition are themselves going to be at a disadvantage and are going to be treated unequally. But if you say, no, no, we have a conception of culture that's very broad, that can encompass all the diversity in our society, then it's not clear how welcoming immigrants is going to dilute your culture in any way. And this, in fact, also gives us an egalitarian dilemma. If you want to treat your people equally, as you surely will with all your citizens, then controlling immigration by saying, well, we're only going to admit those people who fit in culturally is going to mean treating your own citizens unequally to the extent that they are culturally diverse. And then let me conclude by just looking at the argument that says we need immigration control because we want to determine our future for ourselves. And here what I want to point out, and it varies country to country, but particularly in the countries of the liberal democratic West, the problem with this argument is that it actually assumes something that's not defensible. Firstly, that there is in fact a shared conception of what the nation is and what the self is. If you took Britain, for example, take into account the Scottish nationalists or the people of Ireland or the people of Wales who consider themselves to be separate nations, arguing that there is a single self is problematic. But the other thing to consider is simply that immigration control is actually not simply a matter of we or us or the population taking control. It's a matter of governments exercising control. And even then, not exercising control on their own, because the immigration control regime is not a national regime, it's an international one. Immigration globally is not controlled by local populations, it's controlled by global political institutions who make the regulations that govern international travel, international movement of people, and international immigration. If you think that immigration control means self-determination, it's really not for you as an individual citizen whose self is getting back in control. What you're really doing is you're ceding much more control to your governments, and ultimately that government is ceding much more control than it imagines to the rest of the world. Why would one think this is self-determination, and why would one think it's a good idea? Let me leave it at that, although there's much more to say, and I'll be happy to take questions.